If you had asked me a year ago, I would have told you that my marriage to Layla was unshakable. We had been together for 8 years, married for 5, and I genuinely thought we were one of those couples who'd grow old together, sharing morning coffee and inside jokes that only we understood. But then, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything huge or dramatic. No screaming matches or slammed doors. Just small shifts that crept in quietly. Layla became more distant. She was always on her phone, texting someone she never seemed to mention. She started staying late at work more often than usual, claiming big projects were keeping her tied up. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh it off, saying I was being paranoid. You know how the office is, Tom. It's just work stress. At first, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But as weeks went by, the distance between us grew. The warmth in her eyes started fading, and our conversations became shorter, more forced. It felt like I was living with a stranger who used to be my best friend. So, I decided to plan something special, a night out to our favorite restaurant, the Lantern Bistro. I thought maybe a quiet evening, just the two of us, could bring us back to what we used to be. I wanted to believe we could fix whatever was broken, but that night, I discovered just how broken things really were. I remember putting on my best shirt that evening, the one Layla always said made my eyes look bluer. It felt stupid in hindsight, dressing up for someone who had already checked out of our marriage. But back then, I still believed. I still thought this dinner could fix what was falling apart. Layla came down the stairs, looking stunning as always in that green dress I bought her for our anniversary 2 years ago. The same dress she used to say made her feel beautiful. But when I complimented her, all I got was a polite smile. The kind you give a coworker when they hold the door open, not the man you've shared 8 years of your life with. We drove to the Lantern Bistro in near silence. I tried making small talk, asked about her day, her work, even joked about the terrible traffic. But her answers were short, distracted. She kept glancing at her phone, her fingers tapping nervously against the screen. When I asked who she was texting, she shrugged it off, just work stuff, Tom. You know how it is. I didn't push. I wanted this night to go smoothly, to remind us of the connection we used to have, but deep down, that nagging feeling wouldn't let go. When we arrived at the restaurant, we were greeted by warm lights, the soft clinking of glasses, and the familiar hum of quiet conversations. It was the kind of place that used to feel special to us. A little escape from the everyday routine. But tonight, it felt like a stage, and we were both just playing roles. We sat at our usual table by the window, the one with a view of the city lights. I ordered a bottle of wine, hoping it would loosen whatever tension was sitting between us. Layla barely touched her glass. She kept glancing toward the back of the restaurant, her eyes darting like she was waiting for someone, or something. I tried to ignore it. I tried to pretend everything was fine. But when she excused herself to freshen up for the 3rd time in under an hour, something snapped inside me. I watched her walk toward the back of the restaurant, disappearing around the corner toward the restrooms. I sat there for a minute, staring at the untouched wine, the empty seat across from me, and the hollow feeling growing in my chest. Then, without really thinking about it, I stood up. I wasn't the jealous type. I'd never been the guy to snoop through her things or question her every move. But tonight, something felt different. The distance in her eyes, the constant glances at her phone, the way she kept disappearing, it all added up to something I could no longer ignore. So, I followed her. The hallway leading to the restrooms was dimly lit and quiet, a sharp contrast to the lively buzz of the dining area. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of fear and anger coursing through me. When I reached the corner, I stopped. That's when I heard it, soft laughter. A hushed voice, Layla's voice. And then, something that made my blood run cold. A muffled moan. I felt my stomach twist, a wave of nausea washing over me. I should have turned around. I should have walked away. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the bathroom door open just enough to see through the crack, and there she was, Layla, pressed up against the wall, her hands tangled in the hair of a man I'd never seen before. Their bodies were intertwined in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't just some innocent flirtation. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Right there, in the bathroom of the restaurant where we were supposed to be saving our marriage. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. I wanted to burst in, to scream, to demand answers. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of what I had just witnessed. I let the door quietly close and stumbled back into the hallway, my mind spinning. The woman I loved, the life we'd built together, it was all a lie, and in that moment, I realized nothing would ever be the same again. I don't know how long I stood in that dim hallway, staring at the floor, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was racing, but my body felt frozen, like it hadn't caught up with what I'd just seen. Layla, the woman I'd shared 8 years of my life with, was in that bathroom, tangled up with a complete stranger. Like I didn't even exist, but I did exist, and I wasn't going to stand there and let her erase me. The anger hit me like a wave, crashing over the shock and numbness. My heart pounded in my chest as I marched back to our table, sitting down like nothing had happened, staring at her untouched wine glass while my mind played out the confrontation 100 different ways. A few minutes later, she appeared. Her hair was slightly mussed, her face flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the wine she hadn't touched. She slid into her seat across from me, smoothing her dress like everything was perfectly normal. I stared at her, my jaw clenched so tight I thought I might break a tooth. She gave me that fake smile, the one she'd perfected over the past few months. "Sorry, the line was long," she said, picking up her glass like she hadn't just destroyed our marriage in the back of the restaurant. I didn't say anything. I just watched her, letting the silence stretch between us, waiting for her to squirm, but she didn't. She took a sip of her wine, setting the glass down with a soft clink, finally meeting my eyes. "What?" she asked, her tone light, like I was the one being weird. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "How was the bathroom, Layla?" For a split second, her eyes widened. Just a flicker. But it was enough. She quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "What's that supposed to mean?" I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Don't play dumb. I saw you." The color drained from her face, but she still clung to her facade. "Saw me what?" "Tom, you're acting crazy." Crazy. That word hit harder than anything else. She wasn't just lying, she was gaslighting me, trying to make me question what I'd seen with my own eyes. I leaned in closer, my voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you with him, Layla. In the bathroom. Don't insult me by pretending it didn't happen." For a moment, she just stared at me, the mask finally slipping. Then, with a defiant tilt of her chin, she shrugged. "So what if you did?" she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "Maybe if you'd been paying more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed to find it somewhere else." Her words were like a punch to the gut. But beneath the hurt, the anger burned brighter. I sat back, staring at her like I was seeing her for the first time. "Wow," I whispered, shaking my head. "You really are something else." She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Don't act like this is all on me, Tom. You've been distant for months. You're boring, predictable. I needed excitement." I let out a bitter laugh, standing up from the table. "Well, I hope he was exciting enough for you, Layla. Because you just threw away 8 years for a quick fumble in a restaurant bathroom." I didn't wait for her response. I grabbed my coat, threw some cash on the table, and walked out the door, leaving her sitting there with the wreckage of what used to be us. But as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something. The worst part wasn't that she cheated, the worst part was that I didn't even recognize the woman I had married anymore. Walking out of the Lantern Bistro felt surreal, like stepping out of a nightmare I hadn't fully woken up from. The cool night air hit my face, but it didn't bring the clarity I hoped for. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, disbelief, heartbreak, all tangled up in a knot I couldn't untangle. I reached my car and just stood there for a moment, gripping the door handle, staring at my reflection in the window. I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. He looked hollow, like someone who just had the ground ripped out from under him. I finally slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold against my back. I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard but not really seeing it. My heart was still racing, my thoughts spinning like a broken record. 8 years of memories, of building a life together, thrown away for a meaningless encounter in a restaurant bathroom. I started the car, the engine's rumble grounding me just enough to pull out of the parking lot. The streets were quiet, the world blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside me. As I drove, my mind replayed everything, the way Layla laughed at my jokes when we first met, the vacations we took, the plans we made for our future. It all felt like someone else's life now, like I was watching a movie I used to star in but had long since been written out of. But the part that hurt the most, I didn't see it coming. Halfway home, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down and saw her name flashing on the screen, Layla. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of fury and curiosity bubbling up. I let it ring. She called again, and again. Finally, I answered, my voice cold and flat. "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to make me wonder if she'd hung up. But then her voice came through, shaky but defensive. "Tom, please, can we just talk about this?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, biting back the words I wanted to scream. "Talk about what, Layla? About how you humiliated me in public? About how you've been lying to me for God knows how long?" She sighed, and for the first time, I heard a hint of regret, or maybe it was just exhaustion. "It didn't mean anything, Tom. It was a mistake." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean anything? You call that a mistake?" "No, Layla. Forgetting to pick up milk is a mistake. What you did? That's something else entirely." She went quiet, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize, admit the gravity of what she'd done. But instead, she said the one thing I wasn't prepared for: "I don't think we've been happy for a long time, Tom. Maybe this was just inevitable." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All the nights I'd stayed up worrying about her, all the effort I'd put into trying to fix what was broken, it all meant nothing to her. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I spoke. "Maybe you're right, Layla. But the difference is, I was willing to fight for us. You gave up the second you found a convenient distraction." She didn't respond. I didn't wait for her to. I hung up. When I finally pulled into our driveway, the house looked different. It wasn't home anymore. It was just a place filled with broken promises and memories that now felt tainted. I sat there for a while, staring at the front door, wondering how I was going to face the life we'd built together, knowing it was all a lie. Eventually, I got out of the car, walked inside, and closed the door behind me, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt completely, utterly alone. The moment I stepped inside, the house felt suffocating. The walls, the furniture, even the faint scent of Layla's perfume, it all felt foreign, like I was walking into someone else's life. I dropped my keys on the counter and just stood there in the quiet. No TV in the background, no Layla laughing at one of her shows, no warmth. Just silence. I wandered into the living room, my eyes landing on a framed photo of us from our 3rd anniversary, smiling, arms wrapped around each other like we had the whole world ahead of us. I stared at that photo for a long time, wondering when everything had started to fall apart. But the truth was, it didn't matter when. All that mattered was that it had. I grabbed the photo, turned it face down, and sank into the couch, the weight of the night finally settling in, and for the first time, I let myself feel it. I barely slept that night. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. The way Layla laughed when we first met. The vacations we took. The plans we made. And then, the look on her face when I confronted her, like I was the problem. By morning, the house felt even emptier. I could hear every creak in the floorboards, every tick of the clock on the wall. But the loudest sound was the one inside my head, the question I couldn't shake: how did it come to this? I got up, made coffee out of habit, and stared out the window, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. Divorce? Separation? I didn't even know where to start, but one thing was clear: I couldn't stay stuck in this house, surrounded by memories that felt like lies. So I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I didn't have a plan when I walked out the door. I just needed to move, to get away from the walls that felt like they were closing in on me. Driving without a destination felt strangely liberating. The familiar streets blurred past as my mind raced through everything that had happened. I ended up at Mike's place, my best friend since college. We hadn't talked as much lately, life had gotten busy. But right now, he was the only person I could think of. When he opened the door and saw the look on my face, he didn't ask questions. He just stepped aside and let me in. We sat in his living room, and for a while, I couldn't get the words out. It felt too surreal to say it out loud. But eventually, it all spilled out: the dinner, the bathroom, the confrontation. Every raw, humiliating detail. Mike didn't interrupt. He just sat there, letting me get it out, and when I finally finished, he shook his head. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he muttered. "I'm so sorry." Hearing him say that hit me harder than I expected. It made everything feel real. We sat there in silence for a bit before he finally spoke up again. "What are you gonna do?" I stared at the floor, my mind blank. What was I going to do? I hadn't even started to figure that out. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't go back to that house tonight." Mike nodded, like he'd already expected that. "Stay here as long as you need, man. We'll figure it out." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a small flicker of relief. I wasn't alone in this. Sleeping on Mike's couch wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was better than being in that house, surrounded by reminders of Layla. I stared at the ceiling most of the night, but at least I wasn't alone with my thoughts echoing off the empty walls. The next morning, Mike handed me a mug of coffee without saying a word. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence says more than any words could. As I sipped the coffee, reality started to settle in. I couldn't just crash on Mike's couch forever. I needed to start doing something, anything, to pull myself out of this mess. So, I did the first thing I could think of. I texted Layla. "I'm coming by later to get some of my stuff. Don't be there." It was cold, but I didn't care. I couldn't face her, not yet. I needed space, and more importantly, I needed to be in that house without her presence suffocating me. Her reply came quickly. "Fine." No apology. No attempt to explain. Just fine. That told me everything I needed to know. I finished my coffee, looked at Mike, and nodded. "I'm heading back to the house." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You need anything, you call me." And with that, I left, ready to face the wreckage of my old life. Walking back into the house felt like stepping onto a battlefield after the fight was over. Everything was exactly where we'd left it: the wine glasses from that disastrous dinner still in the sink, Layla's jacket draped over the back of the couch. But it all felt hollow, like I was looking at a life that didn't belong to me anymore. I moved through the rooms mechanically, grabbing the essentials: clothes, toiletries, my laptop. I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was just trying to get through this. But as I passed by our bedroom, something stopped me. Her phone. It was sitting on the nightstand, screen dark, like it held secrets I wasn't supposed to see. For a second, I just stared at it, debating. I'd already seen enough. What was the point of digging deeper? But curiosity, that ugly little itch, got the better of me. I picked it up and swiped the screen. No passcode. The messages were all there, confirming what I already knew. But there was more: conversations with other guys, some dating back months. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was a pattern, and that's when it hit me. It wasn't just about that night at the restaurant. Layla had been lying to me for a long time. The woman I thought I knew never really existed. I set the phone down, suddenly feeling exhausted. But weirdly, there was a strange sense of clarity too. I was done. Whatever hope I had for fixing things was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at Layla's phone, my mind reeling from everything I'd just seen. It wasn't just one guy in a restaurant bathroom. There were others. Names I didn't recognize, conversations that made it clear this wasn't some isolated mistake, it was who she had become. There were messages about sneaking around while I was at work, late-night hookups when she claimed she was working overtime, even a thread with someone saved as Gym Buddy, a guy she'd apparently been meeting after her so-called yoga classes. Every text was another punch to the gut, another reminder that the woman I thought I knew was a complete stranger. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the same bed we'd shared for years, and let it all sink in. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a life built on lies. And the worst part? I didn't even feel shocked anymore. Just numb that I could have confronted her again. I could have sent her screenshots of every message, demanded explanations for every lie. But what was the point? I'd already seen enough. Nothing she said could fix this. There was no going back. So instead, I grabbed a duffel bag, stuffed it with everything I could think of, clothes, my laptop, important documents, and zipped it shut. I wasn't just leaving for the night this time. I was done. Before I left, I grabbed a sticky note from the kitchen drawer and scribbled a message. I saw everything. Don't bother calling me. We're done. I stuck it on the fridge, the same fridge where we used to leave each other little love notes, reminders to pick up groceries, or plans for date nights. Funny how quickly things could change. I took one last look around the house, at the life I thought we'd built together, and then I walked out the door without looking back. Leaving the house wasn't as satisfying as I thought it would be. I expected to feel relief, maybe even a sense of victory for finally cutting ties with Layla. But instead, I felt empty. Like I'd just walked out of a life I didn't know how to replace. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the roads take me wherever they wanted. Eventually, I ended up back at Mike's place. He opened the door, took one look at the duffel bag in my hand, and didn't ask any questions. You're staying as long as you need, he said simply. We sat in his living room that night, beers in hand, watching some mindless show on TV. I wasn't really paying attention. My mind kept drifting back to everything that had happened. The dinner. The bathroom. The messages. But somewhere between the silence and the occasional small talk, I realized something: that I was free, not just from Layla's lies, but from the constant weight of trying to fix something that had been broken for a long time. As much as it hurt, there was a strange sense of clarity in knowing that the worst was behind me. I didn't have all the answers yet, and I didn't know what the future looked like. But for the first time in months, I wasn't stuck in the past, and that was a start. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. I'd wake up on Mike's couch, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar sounds of Layla in the kitchen, her humming, the clinking of mugs. But they never came. And every morning, I had to remind myself why. But somewhere in that fog, I started to find my footing. The first step was telling my family. That was harder than I expected. Sitting across from my mom, watching her face crumble as I explained what happened, it made the betrayal feel fresh all over again. But there was also a strange comfort in it. Saying the words out loud, sharing the burden, made it feel real. And in a way, that helped me start letting go. The second step was paperwork. Divorce papers. I thought that part would be the most painful, but it wasn't. It was just necessary. Signing those papers felt like closing a door that had been hanging open for too long. There was no going back, and for once, I didn't want to. I started focusing on the small things. I got back into running, something I'd given up when life got too busy. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years because Layla always had some excuse not to go out. I even picked up new hobbies, things I'd always wanted to try but never did because we were always too busy being us. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was starting to feel like myself again. One night, Mike and I were out at a bar, just catching up, when he said something that stuck with me. You know, man, this could be the best thing that ever happened to you. I laughed at first, because how could something so painful be good? But later, lying awake on his couch, I thought about it. Maybe he was right. Layla's betrayal had ripped my life apart, but it also gave me a chance to rebuild. to figure out who I was without her. And as scary as that was, it was also freeing that I wasn't the same person I was when this all started, and that was a good thing. Months passed, and slowly, the sharp edges of Layla's betrayal began to dull. The memories were still there, sure, but they didn't sting like they used to. I no longer woke up thinking about what went wrong or replaying that night at the Lantern Bistro over and over in my head. Instead, I started focusing on what was ahead of me. I moved out of Mike's place and into a small apartment across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I had a space that reflected who I was, not who we were. I filled it with things that made me happy, not compromises or half-hearted decor decisions Layla had talked me into. It felt good to have that kind of control over my life again. I dove into new routines. I signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never got around to. I joined a running group and found a sense of camaraderie in people who had no idea about my past. There was something refreshing about meeting new people who didn't know me as Tom, Layla's husband. I was just Tom, but healing wasn't a straight line. There were still moments, random, unexpected ones, when it would all come flooding back. Like walking past a restaurant we used to go to, or hearing a song that played on one of our road trips. But instead of letting those memories pull me under, I learned to let them pass. They were just moments, not my whole story. Then, something unexpected happened. At one of those photography classes, I met Sophie. She wasn't flashy or over the top. Just real. We started talking after class, bonding over our terrible attempts at night photography and our shared love for old-school music. At first, it was just casual, grabbing coffee after class, laughing about life's weird twists and turns. But over time, I realized I looked forward to seeing her. Not because I needed a distraction, but because being around her felt easy. Natural. One evening, as we sat on a park bench, cameras slung over our shoulders, Sophie asked me a question I hadn't expected. So, what's your story? For a moment, I hesitated. I didn't want to unload my baggage on her. But there was something in her eyes, this quiet understanding, that made me feel like I could be honest. So, I told her. Not every gritty detail, but enough. She didn't flinch. She didn't give me pity, either. She just nodded, like she got it. Well, she said after a pause, sounds like you've been through hell. But you're still standing. That's something. And just like that, I realized she was right. That I was still standing. Things with Sophie unfolded in a way that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't rushed or intense. It wasn't about filling a void left by Layla. It was about discovering a new chapter, one that didn't need to be defined by the past. That we kept things light at first. Weekend photography trips, spontaneous coffee runs, late-night conversations about everything from music to our biggest regrets. There was an ease to being around her, like I didn't have to pretend to be okay or hide the scars from what I'd been through. She never pressured me to open up, but when I did, she listened, not with sympathy, but with understanding. One night, we found ourselves walking along the riverfront, the city lights reflecting off the water. We just finished taking some photos, and Sophie stopped, staring out at the skyline. You ever think about how the worst thing in your life might be the best thing that ever happened to you? She asked. That I let her words sink in. 6 months ago, I would have laughed at that idea. I would have told her that nothing could justify the betrayal I felt in that restaurant or the months of heartbreak that followed. But standing there with her, watching the water ripple under the city lights, I realized something. That I wasn't the same man who had walked into that restaurant, blind to the cracks in his marriage. That I was stronger. I'd learned to stand on my own. And most importantly, I'd learned to trust myself again. A few weeks later, the divorce was finalized. It felt strange, seeing it there in black and white, my marriage reduced to a stack of legal documents and signatures. But as I slid the papers into a drawer, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was official, that chapter of my life was closed. I didn't hear much from Layla after that. A few half-hearted texts about picking up the rest of her stuff, a formal email about dividing some last-minute finances. But that was it. And honestly, that was exactly how I wanted it. She was part of my story, but she wasn't the story. Sophie and I continued to grow closer, but what mattered most was that I was finally living life for me. I wasn't defined by my past, by my mistakes, or by Layla's betrayal. I was defined by how I chose to move forward. That I found joy in the little things again, early morning runs, lazy Sunday afternoons with a good book, even just sitting on my balcony with Max, watching the sunset. I realized that happiness didn't come from someone else. It came from finding peace within yourself. One night, as Sophie and I sat on that same park bench where we first really talked, she turned to me and smiled. "You look lighter," she said. "Like you finally let go of something." I thought about that for a moment. "I guess I did," I replied. "I let go of who I thought I needed to be. And I figured out who I actually am." She squeezed my hand, and in that simple gesture, I realized how far I'd come, not just from Layla, but from the version of myself that didn't believe I could survive without her. It's strange how life has a way of circling back, not to remind you of your pain, but to show you how far you've come. A year ago, I thought I'd never recover from what Layla did to me. I thought her betrayal would define me forever, that every relationship, every step forward, would be overshadowed by the memory of that night in the restaurant. But standing here now, I see things differently. A few months after my divorce was finalized, I decided to do something symbolic. I went back to the Lantern Bistro, the same place where everything fell apart. It wasn't about reopening old wounds, it was about proving to myself that I wasn't afraid of my past anymore. I didn't go alone. Sophie came with me. When we walked in, I half expected to feel a surge of anger or sadness. But all I felt was peace. The restaurant was just a restaurant. The walls hadn't changed, but I had. We sat at a different table, ordered different food, and made new memories in a place I once thought was ruined for me. Halfway through the meal, Sophie looked at me and smiled. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah. Better than okay." Because I realized that night that Layla's betrayal wasn't the defining moment of my life. It was just a turning point. A painful one, sure, but one that led me to where I was supposed to be. In the months that followed, Sophie and I grew even closer. But what made our relationship different was that I wasn't clinging to her to fix me. I was whole on my own, and she just fit into that. I started focusing on things that made me happy outside of relationships. I took my photography more seriously, even showcasing some of my work at a local gallery. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to go, met people who inspired me, and pushed myself in ways I never thought I could. But the biggest change was internal. I learned to trust again, not just other people, but myself. I realized that I could survive heartbreak and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And that knowledge was more valuable than anything Layla could have ever given me. One evening, as Sophie and I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "If you could go back and change what happened with Layla, would you?" I thought about it for a long moment. The easy answer was yes. Who wouldn't want to avoid that kind of pain? But the truth was more complicated. "No," I said finally. "I wouldn't change a thing." She raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "Yeah. Because if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have learned what I'm capable of. And I wouldn't have met you." She smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Funny how life works, huh?" "Yeah," I whispered. "It really is." So, if you're reading this and going through something similar, here's what I'll tell you: betrayal hurts. It shakes you to your core. But it doesn't have to break you. The pain doesn't last forever, even if it feels like it will. And sometimes, the worst thing that ever happens to you leads to the best thing you never saw coming, because life isn't about avoiding the storm. It's about learning to dance in the rain. A year and a half after the night that tore my marriage apart, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come, not just in terms of healing, but in how my perspective on life, love, and even myself had shifted. What once felt like the end of the world had become the catalyst for a new beginning I never anticipated. One day, out of nowhere, I received an email from Layla that I stared at her name in my inbox, unsure whether I even wanted to open it. Part of me felt that old, familiar sting of betrayal, but it was faint, like a scar that didn't hurt anymore when you touched it. Against my better judgment, or maybe because I knew it wouldn't affect me the way it once did, I clicked it open. "Hey Tom, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, and I get that. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for what happened, I know that can't be undone, but for how I treated you afterward. You didn't deserve that. I hope you found happiness. Layla." I sat there for a moment, reading and rereading her words. A year ago, this would have sent me spiraling. But now? It felt like reading a note from someone I barely recognized that I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I realized I didn't need to. Her apology wasn't for me, it was for her. I didn't need closure from her. I had already given it to myself. Later that evening, Sophie and I were cooking dinner together in my apartment. The simple act of chopping vegetables, laughing about a failed recipe, and feeling the ease of her presence made me realize something profound, that I had spent so much time in my marriage trying to be the person Layla wanted me to be, bending and molding myself to fit into a life we were supposed to have. But with Sophie, there were no expectations. No masks. Just two people choosing to share their lives because it made sense, because it felt right. As we sat down to eat, Sophie glanced at me with that knowing look she always had when she could sense my mind was somewhere else. "You good?" she asked, a soft smile tugging at her lips that I nodded. "Yeah. I'm really good." And I meant it. A few weeks later, Sophie suggested we take a trip, a road trip along the coast, stopping at little towns, taking photos, and just being. We laughed the entire way, singing along to terrible playlists, eating at roadside diners, and snapping photos of sunsets that reminded me how beautiful life could be when you let go of the weight holding you down. At one point, while watching the waves crash against the rocks, Sophie turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if things hadn't fallen apart?" I didn't even have to think about it. "I think about how much smaller my life would have been," I said. "I would have been stuck in a life I didn't realize wasn't meant for me. And I wouldn't have known what real happiness felt like." She reached over, took my hand, and we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Fast forward to today, and I've come to realize something important: life doesn't go according to plan. The people you think will stay forever might leave. The dreams you build might crumble. But sometimes, losing what you thought you needed makes space for what you truly deserve. Betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, they're not the end. They're just part of the journey, and if you're lucky, like I was, you'll find yourself on the other side of that pain, standing in a life you never expected, but one that feels exactly right, because sometimes, the best stories begin after the worst chapters end.